Family, our connection to history, a bridge that can lead us to our future while shielding us from the sometime treacherous waters of life. In it lies comfort, familiarity, counsel in times of doubt, but at the same time, no matter the level of love you have for those that came before you, you do have your own path to choose. This path can be paved with wise words and anecdotes, or our very own mistakes, but make no doubt about it, the path is yours. On today's episode, I'd like to delve into the idea of family and how it can relate to the decisions we make. This is not to eliminate the idea of free will, but to illuminate the idea that sometimes, not every time, but sometimes, what worked in the past, no matter how beneficial it was at the time, can somehow and sometimes be a terrible idea in our current circumstance. What happens when a way of life sustained by tradition and the common good is set against a different way of life? A life without rules or even consequence. This was the story of Montezuma II, emperor of the mighty Aztec nation, equipped with every accoutrement that life could offer, except the one thing that mattered most: preparation. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, Season 2, Episode 4. Thank you for joining me for the fourth episode of the second season. As I alluded to before, this episode is going to be about the idea of family, but not in a way to besmirch the idea of family. I love my family, every single one of them, but this is the idea of just how things that worked formerly are not applicable to the times that we live in. And just as usual, you have to be malleable and be able to adjust. But enough of the preamble. To begin, more than 500 years ago, the mighty Aztec Empire was one of the best kept secrets in the world. Not only was the empire growing at a rapid pace, but the people were fairly healthy, intelligent, and full of hope for the days and years to come. At the helm of that empire was Montezuma II. The entirety of his name I won't even attempt to pronounce, but interpret it. His name means angry like a lord. Before him, the Aztecs were ruled by his father, EXCERPT, and his uncle, Ahutzotl, after him. And although they both died likely by the hands of poison, Montezuma was allowed to sit at the foot of both men and learn the ins and outs of leadership well before his time. Unlike most royalty, the Aztecs did not allow one to rule simply due to birth. To rule, one would need to prove himself in battle several times over until rising in the ranks with enough know-how and respect to rule. This was the case for Montezuma. Truth be told, his father's reign wasn't a very fruitful one. There were several defeats from various tribes throughout central Mexico. Some even say this was the cause of his dubious death, but by the time the reins of the kingdom was handed down to Montezuma via selection, he was steeped in warfare, politics, and even learned the priesthood by the age of 30. Montezuma was allowed to absorb the traditions of his forefathers and lead his people forward with all the knowledge collected by the 8 emperors who preceded him. With Montezuma at the helm, the Aztecs were able to gain control of most of central Mexico with relative ease. Like most empires, there was a significant amount of bloodshed, but what was different about the Aztecs was their methods. Their society was heavily dependent on sacrifice, and to be clear, I mean human sacrifice. On the battlefield, the spoils of war were rarely killed. The Aztec weapons were designed to harm their opponents, not take their life. Their obsidian blades and clubs were simply instruments of demobilization. A club to the head, a shattered knee, even a limb lost was just a means to an end. Once incapacitated, the wounded were rounded up, imprisoned, and eventually used as sacrifice to the gods of rain, war, or fire. At the foot of his uncle, Montezuma witnessed several of these sacrifices, some as large as 20,000 men. Within 16 years, the Aztecs had conquered to the point that Montezuma himself changed his status from emperor to living god dictator. All of the lessons he had learned from his father and their fathers before him had placed him at a unique position where, seemingly, due to the might and size of the Aztecs, losing not only was impossible, it wasn't even a thought. This belief began to falter slightly. Among the people, there were rumors of floating temples seen to the east traveling by water. The inhabitants were made of shiny armor never seen before, with hair that covered the majority of their faces. They rode on four-legged beasts and spoke a language unfamiliar, and above all of that, they could easily be a threat. Montezuma dismissed the idea of these new aliens and assumed that when the time came, he would be able to speak to them, give them a few women, a few pieces of gold, and send them on their way. What Montezuma didn't understand was that the leader of these men was one Hernán Cortés, a ruthless conquistador from Spain, eager to make a name for himself and his family as well. More rumors began to reach the emperor's ears. 500 killed by the Spanish, then 1,000, then 6,000. So much so that within his heart Montezuma knew that resistance would only lead to the demise of him and his people. Quickly. As the Spanish grew closer to the capital city of Tenochtitlan, Montezuma attempted to manipulate the Spanish by sending women and trinkets and gold. The Spanish even sent gifts back to the emperor, but although Montezuma assumed that this exchange was a way of acknowledging his rulership, it was actually bait, used by the Spanish to make the Aztecs lower their defenses and assume there was a friendship to be had. Unbeknownst to the god emperor, Cortés and his men, along with Marina, his indigenous interpreter, had gathered the opposing tribes around them and enlisted them to aid them in their quest. By the time the Spanish reached the capital city, a marvel set in the midst of an island in the center of Lake Texcoco, the Aztecs believed that they were among friends, while the Spanish, Cortés in particular, knew that they were about to take over a rich and plentiful tribe of men, women, and children who militarily posed no threat whatsoever. Montezuma gave Cortés a tour, showed him the great temples and gold mines. He even offered his daughter to the Spaniard as a gift. But within days, he found himself captured and taken hostage as the Spanish ravaged the city, stealing, killing, and disrespecting all of their traditions. Still thinking that there was a chance to save himself, Montezuma became used as a puppet, a proxy, a pacifier placed in the mouths of the people whenever they started to rise against the conquerors. Montezuma, from his balcony, would assure the people that all was well, and that these bearded monsters would soon leave, and that he was still in power. He attempted to convince them that although things seemed to be bad, there was a master plan which would leave them not only more well off than before, but appreciative to the Spanish for bringing them Christianity and a better way of life. Shamefully, things went on this way until two things happened. One, the Spanish removed the Aztec symbols and totems from a pyramid and placed a cross on top. And two, on sacred ground, 3,000 men were killed during a holy ritual. The people were left in fear. They were starving and in need of a true leader. And by the time Montezuma once again stood on the balcony in an attempt to ease the hearts and minds of his people, it was far too late. He was met by boos and hisses. Then rocks and other items were tossed at him until finally a well-placed shot to the head fractured his skull, leaving him convulsing and bloodied on the ground. Days later, Montezuma was dead, and a brutal slaughter known as the Night of Tears took place, killing thousands and eventually forcing Cortés and the Spanish to flee, only to return later to pick up exactly where they left off, this time with more force than ever. To this day, those that know the story of Montezuma II view him as a traitor and a coward, a man so frightened to lose his life in the defense of his people that he ended up losing the entire kingdom. In his case, he was stuck in the past. The former way of handling an adversary was useless, and he wasn't prepared. He was used to beguiling his enemies with words and jewels, but he had no idea of what to do when the words fell upon deaf ears, and the jewels did nothing but fuel the desire for more. In the end, although Montezuma was an emperor who was in a lineage of rulers dating back hundreds and hundreds of years, all of that experience, all of that teaching, all of that know-how was ended simply because the opponent couldn't care less. We'll be right back. Episode, as I stated before, we are going to go through the idea of family. And for me, in an attempt to do something different, I'm going to basically read a portion of the first chapter of a little thing that I'm working on. And the first chapter of it, it's very closely related to our subject matter today. The novel is entitled Under the Umbrella Thorn, and this is simply the first chapter, and if things go well, maybe intermittently I'll kind of sneak a chapter in here and there. But to begin, we will begin. Before men became obsessed with time, and the sun was the only indicator of the day, Chabundu Adesina managed to harness the power of the moon. Most people of the age considered the moon to be frightening, a harbinger of doom from whence demons and shadows sought refuge. Mothers tucked their children in at night with warnings of assorted creatures of darkness, while emphasizing the importance of prayer and supplication. The children obeyed their mother's warnings. There was no evidence for nor against these tales, and the odds of their mothers knowingly filling their heads with lies seemed unlikely. However, Chabundu was born a skeptic. At the age of 2, his mother Quinto misplaced him while harvesting the fields. In hysterics, she explained to the village that she set him beneath an umbrella thorn while gathering potatoes for an upcoming wedding feast. Her tribe was the Magi. Among the neighboring clans, they were the largest and most wealthy. Their lands were filled with livestock and precious metals. Large compounds surrounded the perimeter of each village. Every edifice towered above the villagers' huts like a watchful, clay-hewn giant. Over the years, peace had become a normality. The era of warrior kings and continuous strife had faded into memory. The Magi had become renowned farmers and craftsmen, The men, averaging 6.5 feet tall, were dark-skinned and comely. The women were shapely and fertile, each child cherubic and pleasant. Life was a predictable kaleidoscope of naivete. Worries of starvation and disease had morphed into the certitude of food and longevity. In short, the Magi had become complacent. It was within that complacency that Quinto casually strolled through the fields picking potatoes, her back facing her 2-year-old son, singing one of her favorite tribal songs, which went, "Water knows the sky, water knows the wind, water knows everything, beginning to the end." Chibundo was out of her sight for no longer than a minute. She knew this because she counted each potato before placing them in her basket, and she had reached number 12 before turning to find her son absent. At once, the men of the village set out to find Chibundo. Every man of age and strength to carry weapons, in this case spears, entered into the forest in search of the boy. Minutes became hours, and by nightfall, the men returned to the village empty-handed. Perhaps a panther had eaten him, or the boy had fallen from one of the many cliffs that encamped the settlement. No one knew for certain, but what they did know was that Quinto had made a shameful error. Days passed, then years. Quinto became a shell of her former self. The elders advised her to fast and make offerings to Inu, the great god of loss. The villagers believed that if one showed enough humility, enough lamentation, Inu would show mercy and return their lost loved ones to them. This was never proven, but over time, these things became an article of faith. Not because they were real, but because guilt kills slowly, and even a sliver of hope contains enough power to bring patience, if not acceptance, over one's fate. With that in mind, Quinto accepted hers. Chibundo was her only child, and in her village, children were the glory of the household. Without a child, her purpose was simply at a standstill. In mourning, the love that she felt for him would not cease, but now it had become trapped, stirring within her like a bottled whirlwind. Quinto knew that the love she had for her son would never die. Therefore, she must. The next day, long before the sun or the village would rise, Quinto journeyed to the plains to be alone and take her own life in peace. She prayed no one would find her. She prayed that some beast would wander along, discover her dead body, and consume her remains. That way, she would become more than what she was. She would become a myth, a cautionary tale. She would become her son. As Quinto walked, she remembered the last words of her father, Ayo. "Your head is hard, and your heart is soft. You will die alone." Ayo was not a quiet man. He believed that his opinion should be admired and remembered. During tribunals, or the settling of disputes, or even in passing, Ayo was always the last to speak. "No one pays attention until the conversation is over," he would say. "That is why you must always get the last word." What he said was seldom true. Mostly the ramblings of a man with low self-esteem. When Ayo was a child, his father, Pari, died of an unknown testicular disease, which filled his hut with the putrid smell of blood and pus. A smell that lingered within the village for weeks after his passing. His final breath was not only the relinquishing of his soul, it was a sigh of relief. The pain, anger, and embarrassment that he could not surmount were finally at its end, and at the very least, he did manage to produce Ayo, a son. For most of his life, Ayo was known as Nua Isi, or son of odor. He made a conscious effort to erase the memory and smell of his father's death from the village. He worked hard, became the owner of 2,000 heads of cattle and 3,000 sheep. He became an expert at constructing altars and structures of worship, not to mention the most handsome man that most of them had ever seen. Ayo's reputation as a strong-willed businessman began to outweigh the shame of his father's passing, to the point that it was accepted that his father, Tari, he simply died of old age, surrounded by his loved ones, underneath the umbrella thorn, with his reputation intact. Now, it was underneath an umbrella thorn that Quinto prepared to take her life. She knew that the area was brimming with hyenas, and that eventually they would find her and help carry her flesh into oblivion. With that in mind, she removed a small blade from her waist and slit her wrists, chanting the name of her son, hoping that he would hear her and welcome her into paradise. As Quinto bled out onto the unforgiving ground of the Serengeti, her eyes drifted to the sun. For some reason, it ceased to rise. In fact, it appeared to reverse itself, fading from day to night. The moon re-emerged, shining brightly in the night sky, surrounded by an audience of stars and Quinto's crying eyes. In amazement, she looked at her wrists and noticed that they had healed. The blood which saturated the ground was now gone. Even her tears had now evaporated. Quinto leapt to her feet, looking for any sign of the demons and night creatures she had warned so many of the villagers about, but there was no one. Only the moon, the stars, and the sound of her palpitating heart. Quinto retrieved her blade from the ground. In her head she thought, I must have fallen asleep. Surely I dreamt that I had slit my wrist, but my sorrow must have overtaken my right mind. Again, Quinto set the blade to her wrist. This time she would be sure to stand and press harder than before. This time she would focus and allow death to take its rightful place in her life. With renewed tears, Quinto began to let the blade dig into her flesh. Only this time she would close her eyes and feel the cold blade as it tore through her wrist indiscriminately. This seemed to work until, suddenly, like lightning forcing its way through the sky, she heard a voice. A child's voice saying, Mama. Quinto opened her eyes, released the blade, and turned to find a now 5-year-old Chabundu standing before her, nude, smiling with his arms outstretched. Overwhelmed with joy and disbelief, Quinto fainted under the moonlight, her son watching her for the first time in many years. By the time they returned to the village, it was midday. Most of the men had gone, some to gather honey, others hunted for food, and only the elders, women, and young children remained. There was a part of Quinto that hoped to go unnoticed. She knew that an onslaught of questions and celebration waited on the other side of their arrival, and part of her wanted to avoid that. She still had questions no man could answer. Her body felt numb, her head felt heavy, and her heart ached in a way she hadn't known since the birth of her son. This was not the ache that came from sorrow or pain, but the kind of ache that occurs when one is overwhelmed with love. She wanted to soak in it, wear it a little longer before the village overtook them. But there was no such luck. Before she could make it to her home, ululations and praise to the god of their ancestors rang out at the very sight of Chabundu. Within seconds, elders and children and anyone who happened to be in the village surrounded them. Some with laughter, others with questions Chabundu couldn't begin to answer. Some just stared and prodded him in disbelief. A few of the villagers gathered in the distance. Their faces were taut and dismissive, whispering among themselves in a gaggle of hatred and judgment. Quinto pretended not to see them. She understood that some people were selfish when it came to happiness, so they could never be happy for anyone else. After the excitement had worn down and the people had dispersed, promising a true celebration once the men returned, Chibundu turned to his mother saying, "I am sleepy. Can I sleep?" Quintu looked into his tired eyes. There was something different there. Something that was not present 3 years ago. Something she had seen in the eyes of her father and mother and the elders of the village. That something was pain. Not the pain of injury or disappointment, but the kind of pain that only wisdom can inflict. "Of course you can sleep, my son. Sleep as long as you like. You are home now." With that, Quintu and Chibundu entered their hut under what was now a blazing sun, both of them knowing before them lie days of questions and answers and suspicion. The inside of the hut was modest. A simple mat on the floor, a small seat carved from wood in the corner, clay pots and pans, and a few choice pieces of cow skin hung proudly from the ceiling. Quintu offered her mat to her son, but Chibundu insisted, saying, "No, Mama. I am sure you are much more tired than me. Take your bed. I can sleep anywhere." Quintu refused, saying, "You are my responsibility. Sleep. I will wake you once the men have arrived." Chibundu accepted, and Quintu watched as he fell into a deep rest. Her heart now filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and praise to Inu for returning her son to her. As she watched, Chibundu stirred in his sleep, tossing and turning with sporadic moans and wilting sighs. Quintu watched this in concern, not knowing that in his slumber, Chibundu traveled to a place not known to men. In his dream, Chibundu found himself in a world formless and without structure. Colors and light seemed to breathe and pulsate through his body. Odd geometric shapes, the likes of which he had never seen, swirled in and out of existence as Chibundu hovered above a fractal maze. In the midst of this, a gentle voice spoke to him, saying, "Chibundu, son of Dagim, have you forgotten why we have sent you to your people? They have forsaken the importance of time. They do not prepare for catastrophe. They celebrate when they should mourn. They give when they should take. They dance when they should run. Do not forget your purpose, Chibundu. Time paves the way for eternity, and eternity approaches." "I have not forgotten, Master," said Chibundu. "I will do what is required of me, but if they were to ask, who shall I say sent me?" "We are Inu," said the voice. Suddenly, Chibundu's body began to pull away from the fractal maze, as if a hand had yanked him upward. The colors and shapes began to fade in the distance, and all he could hear was Quintu's voice saying, "Chibundu, Chibundu, time to awaken, my son." Chibundu opened his eyes in his mother's hut, sweat pouring profusely from his brow, his eyes red and focused on his surroundings. Quintu stood over him with a concerned look on her face. Wiping his forehead, she embraced him, saying, "The men are returning. Get up so I can present you to them." Chibundu rose from his mother's mat and exited the hut to see that the sun had begun to set. The villagers had gathered around the hut, and in the distance the men of the village approached with the day's hunt on their backs. Leading the men into the village was a tall and intimidating man by the name of Zahi. His muscular body was covered with the scars and bruises that seemed to be mandatory for any true hunter. His hands were large and veiny, so large that at first glance one would not notice that his right index finger was missing. Regardless of all of his intimidating features, one thing could not be denied. He was a leader. Not because of the fearlessness or his striking beauty, but because from the time he was born, Zahi seemed to demand respect. This respect was not given. In fact, he was born prematurely and expected to die from the moment his soul touched the earth. Zahi took respect by pure force. To Zahi, each day was a chance to prove himself, and with each day his reputation grew as a skilled craftsman, then hunter, then on the battlefield a warrior equal to none. Before Chibundu was born, Zahi was a close friend of his father Dagim. Together they fought side by side in battle, conquering any land that their eyes would fall upon. Zahi and Dagim even married on the same day. Dagim to Quinto, Zahi to Quinto's younger sister, Hasina. When one fell ill, the other would nurse them to health. If one became hungry, the other would feed him. And when Hasina died of typhoid, Dagim was there to comfort him. If you were not told otherwise, you would assume the two were brothers. Even at Dagim's funeral, Zahi was allowed to ignite the pyre that sent his friend to the bosom of their ancestors. Now they stood face to face. Zahi overjoyed, Chibundu rather sullen and indifferent. "Chibundu," said Quinto, "do you remember who this is? Embrace him." Zahi laughed, saying, "Of course he doesn't remember me, Quinto. Chibundu, I am Zahi, chief of this village and a great friend of your father. You have been gone for many years. We all feel the worst, but we thank Inu you have returned." "You know Inu?" Chibundu said, dropping his stiff veneer. "How do you know them? Do they speak to you as well?" Silence fell over the gathering. Even Quintu seemed to be perplexed. This was the most Chibundu had spoken so far, and it confused everyone around him. "We all know Inu," said Quintu. "He is with us always. In fact, it was Inu that returned you to me." Chibundu chuckled, saying, "Foolish woman, Inu is not a man. Who told you that lie?" Discomfort fell upon the villagers. Slowly and silently they began to disperse. Unknowingly, Chibundu had committed blasphemy, a charge which usually resulted in death. Quintu and Zahi looked to one another with concern as Zahi rubbed Chibundu on the head, saying, "Tonight we celebrate your return. No more talk of gods and their status. Quintu, take your son and prepare him. We will gather at the great boulder by nightfall." Quintu agreed, and Zahi and the remaining villagers departed to their own families. In the distance, cynics whispered amongst themselves. Quintu knew that her son had now stoked the fires of hatred in their hearts, and that it would not be long before jealousy would pay the village a visit as well. Nevertheless, the two of them entered into their hut to prepare for the night. Quintu fully enveloped in fear, Chibundu detached and befuddled by the behavior of men. According to legend, the great boulder, which stood about 105 cubits in height and 80 cubits in length, was the last remaining remnant of the temple of Rokani. The people believe that millions of years ago, before the Serengeti became barren, and when angels lived among humans, Rokani was the first ruler of men. His wisdom and might were so strong that the angels and demons would visit him seeking advice and guidance. Rokani became so admired and respected that the angels and demons decided to work together and build the temple for Rokani to commemorate their friendship. The temple was the largest structure known to man, filled with golden pillars and diamond-encrusted altars. It became the envy of all. The angels were responsible for the temple's upkeep. Often they would be seen cleaning and repairing sections of the structure if needed. Rokani was thankful to the angels, promising to always be a trusted friend, pledging fealty for 1,000 generations. This did not please his demonic colleagues. To them, Rokani had chosen sides, and because of that, his wisdom could no longer be trusted. Over time, when the demons came to visit him, the angels stood guard over the temple, and they were not allowed entry. They were told to conduct their business with Rokani outside. The temple was too holy to be polluted with their presence. Jealousy grew within their hearts, and they decided that Rokani must be killed and the temple destroyed. Knowing that an attack was imminent, the gods came to Rakani to warn him of the betrayal, and they asked permission to smite their demon brethren. In his heart, Rakani did not believe them. There had been disagreements before, but each time it was settled with talk and palm wine. Surely if there was truly a dispute, they could be reasoned with. The gods reminded Rakani that it was indeed his choice, and his choice alone. If he wanted to risk betrayal, it was in his hands, but if he wanted to show mercy, the option was in his hands as well. Rakani could not fathom the idea of betrayal. His wealth and power had grown. His village flourished. He had 30 wives and 5,000 head of oxen. To him, gold was as common as dirt. The thought of losing it all was unacceptable. Therefore, at the threshold of the temple, thousands of demons were gathered and slaughtered as Rakani watched with indifference from his diamond-coated throne. The angels on guard observed with disgusted grins, barely hiding their delight. Over time, the mood amongst the angels began to shift. No longer did they have an adversary. No longer did they feel as though they had anything to prove to Rakani. His wisdom was sound, his guidance always steered them in the right direction, but he was a human, after all. They held eternity in their hands. Only they could travel between the realm of the spirit and flesh with ease. Rakani was just a man, and like all men, he would taste death eventually. Slowly, the angels began to disobey Rakani's commands. Even the temple began to fall apart without the hand of the angels upon it. Rakani's enemies knew this as well. By night, these began to remove the precious stones in and around the temple. By day, an onslaught of sporadic battles had depleted his army of able-bodied men, and without men, the land became vulnerable, withered, and abandoned. Crying out to the gods, Rakani tore his clothes and prostrated himself in his now filthy temple. For 7 days he neither ate nor drank. Each day was spent begging the gods to visit and guide him so he could somehow regain his status among men. On the 8th day, before the rising of the sun, the gods decided to visit, saying,
"Your sorrow has echoed through the cosmos and reached our ears, but we cannot help you."
Confused, Rakani replied, "But if you cannot help me, why did you come? Is it not you who have caused this fate to fall upon me?"
"We gave you a choice,"
said the gods. "You were warned of the betrayal of the demons, but instead of talking to them and hearing their grievances, you had them killed." "But they were evil, my lords. What could I have done other than destroy them?" "You arrogant man," the gods replied.
"Does good and evil not dwell within you? What makes you think it could not dwell in this world as well? You were born ruler. All you had to do was rule."
Rakani wept as the gods returned to their heavenly realm. He refused to leave the temple. The shame of his miscalculation was too much to bear. Time passed. His wives, cattle, and possessions dwindled to nothing. Eventually, a great quake shook the land, causing the temple to collapse upon itself. And even though Rakani was believed to be inside, no one bothered to look for him. What was once the site of the most beautiful structure known to mankind had been reduced to one large boulder, jagged, subdued, and disregarded. But like most tales from the time of their forefathers, this story was passed through the generations with decreasing certainty, eventually becoming a myth told by firelight. To be continued. Thank you for joining me for the 4th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, season 2. Like I said, I'm going to try to do things here and there a little bit different to spice it up. I don't want to be too formulaic. And with that, I'd just like to thank you all for joining me again. By all means, if you have any suggestions, feel free to email me, swtomail@gmail.com. That is swtomail@gmail.com. I would like to say I've never asked for this, but by all means, if you actually like the pod, just go ahead and share it with your friends, do the whole share. It's very easy in Apple or Spotify, whichever method you're using, to actually share this with the people you know. So if you could, go ahead and let someone know about me. Again, I appreciate you all for just lending me your ear. And I hope that, as usual, this episode did something for you. I'm not sure, but just something. At least gives you something to think about. And as always, above all things, be mindful of the stories that you tell yourself. Until next time.